My wife of 40 years asked for a divorce on my 70th birthday. She stood up at the head of the table, smiled at our guests, and slid a thick manila envelope right across the icing of my birthday cake. She looked me in the eye and said she wanted the estate, the luxury cars, and the entire logistics company I built from nothing. She wanted everything except our son. My lawyer later begged me to fight her in court. I refused. I looked at her and said she could have it all. Everyone sitting at that table thought I had lost my mind. They watched me sign away my life's work without shedding a single tear. But what my greedy wife and her arrogant lawyer did not know was that I had already won. She smiled in triumph right until the moment her lawyer whispered 5 devastating words. I am Cornell, 70 years old, and this is the story of my ultimate revenge. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that greed always comes with a heavy price. The crystal chandelier above the long mahogany dining table cast a warm and inviting glow, completely contrasting the freezing, bitter temperature that had just taken over the room. It was supposed to be a milestone celebration of my life. Instead, it felt like a public execution. I stared down at the thick manila envelope resting aggressively against the ruined vanilla frosting of my cake. Valerie stood at the opposite end of the table wearing a custom silk dress that cost more than my very first car. She did not even have the basic decency to wait until the caterers and our dinner guests had left the house. She wanted an audience for my humiliation. She crossed her arms and delivered her demands with a chilling, calculated lack of emotion. She told me she was entirely tired of pretending to be the dutiful, supportive wife of an aging man. She declared that she wanted the 10,000 square foot mansion we currently lived in. She demanded the entire fleet of luxury vehicles sitting in the climate-controlled garage. But most importantly, she firmly stated that she wanted sole ownership of the supply and logistics company that bore my last name. She laid out her extortion like she was casually ordering a meal at a high-end restaurant. Then she turned her cruel, dismissive gaze toward the other end of the table. Tariq, our 38-year-old son, was sitting quietly, his hands folded nervously in his lap. Tariq was a dedicated social worker spending his life helping at-risk youth in the toughest neighborhoods. He never cared for the luxury lifestyle, and Valerie absolutely despised him for it. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at him and laughed a cold, hollow laugh. She told me that I could keep the charity case failure. She stated she had absolutely no use for a son who threw away a prestigious education just to work in the slums for pennies. She actually spoke those horrific words out loud in front of our family and the people we called friends. She told me to pack my bags, take my deeply disappointing son, and vacate the estate premises by the end of the week. She claimed she needed a fresh start, untethered from the dead weight of a husband who was past his prime and a son who actively embarrassed her social circle. The silence in the dining room was heavy and suffocating. Our daughter Monique sat next to Valerie, sipping her expensive champagne, not saying a single word to defend her own flesh and blood brother. Next to Monique sat her husband Bradley. Bradley was a fast-talking, incredibly arrogant opportunist who married into my family strictly for the access to my bank accounts. He leaned back in his chair, swirling his amber drink, watching the brutal destruction of my marriage, like it was an entertaining television show. Neither of them showed a single ounce of shock or pity. I realized right then, looking at their smug faces, that they had orchestrated this entire ambush together. I slowly shifted my gaze back to Tariq. I looked down and noticed his worn-out dress shoes. They were polished carefully, but they were clearly nearing the end of their life. He wore them with pride because he bought them with his own hard-earned money. Looking at those scuffed shoes, a massive flood of memories hit me hard. I remembered 40 years ago, long before the mansion, the sports cars, and the endless private bank accounts. I remembered working grueling 16-hour shifts in the freezing rain at the local lumber yards just to keep the heat on in our tiny, drafty apartment. I remembered the bleeding blisters on my hands and the racist corporate bankers who literally laughed in my face when I asked for a small business loan. I built a massive empire with blood, sweat, and absolute sheer will. And while I broke my back laying the foundation of our generational wealth, Valerie was busy shopping, attending charity galas, and completely forgetting where she came from. She had grown so incredibly accustomed to the heavy gold crown I placed on her head that she completely forgot who built the castle. Any other man in my position would have flipped the dining table in a blind rage. Any other man would have screamed, cursed, or immediately demanded half of everything in a bitter legal war. But I did not raise my voice. I did not show them a single fraction of the intense rage boiling inside my chest. I slowly stood up from my chair, taking my time to adjust the cuffs of my tailored suit jacket. The entire room held its collective breath. Bradley leaned forward with a sickening grin, clearly hoping I would make a complete fool of myself. Valerie lifted her chin defiantly, bracing for a massive shouting match she had undoubtedly rehearsed with her expensive lawyers for months. Instead, I looked at her with a terrifying calmness that seemed to deeply unsettle her. I silenced the quiet whispers spreading around the room by simply raising one hand. I looked deeply into the eyes of the woman I had spent 4 decades providing for, protecting and loving. I saw absolutely no love looking back at me, only a bottomless dark pit of pure entitlement. I nodded slowly, keeping my posture perfectly straight. I told her in a steady, even tone that we did not need to fight. I told her that she did not need to hire legal sharks to bleed me dry in family court. I looked directly at her and simply said, "Agreed, you get it all." Valerie blinked rapidly, completely, taken aback by my total surrender. Monique nearly dropped her champagne glass onto the expensive rug. Bradley let out a low, arrogant chuckle, his face breaking into a wide, victorious smirk. They thought I was just a tired, broken old man who simply lacked the energy to defend his own legacy. They truly believed I was handing over the keys to the kingdom out of pure exhaustion. Bradley could not contain his toxic greed for even a single minute. He stood up abruptly, walked right over to my side of the table, and rudely held out his empty hand. He told me that since I was giving everything up anyway, he might as well take the keys to my vintage Porsche right now. He practically spat in my face, saying a guy taking the public bus would not need a classic sports car. I reached deep into my pocket, pulled out the heavy silver keys, and dropped them directly into his open palm. I gave him a dead, chilling smile and told him to enjoy the ride. He snatched the keys and walked away laughing. Bradley had absolutely no idea that he had just gladly accepted a financial death sentence. At exactly 6 in the morning the very next day, my cell phone vibrated violently against the wooden nightstand. I answered it immediately, to hear Tariq breathing heavily on the other end of the line. He was not a man who panicked easily, but the raw anxiety radiating from his voice was unmistakable. He told me that Monique and Bradley were currently standing on the front porch of the estate guest house. They had not even waited 24 hours after the birthday dinner. They had brought a professional locksmith with them to drill out the heavy deadbolts. I told my son to stay completely calm and instructed him not to engage with them under any circumstances. I threw on a thick wool coat over my flannel shirt and drove straight over to the property. The cold morning mist was still clinging to the manicured lawns when I pulled my vehicle up to the driveway. I stepped out to see my daughter and her husband standing there like conquering royalty, surveying their newly stolen kingdom. The locksmith was already packing up his heavy industrial drill, having successfully breached the solid oak door of the guest house where Tariq had lived peacefully for the past 3 years. Monique stood on the pristine stone walkway, clutching a steaming cup of expensive artisan coffee. She was wearing a designer velvet tracksuit that probably cost more than a month of rent for a normal working family. She did not even have the basic decency to look me in the eye when I walked heavily up the path. She kept her gaze fixed firmly on the distant tree line, pretending I did not exist. Bradley, however, was practically vibrating with toxic, unearned excitement. He stepped right into my path, aggressively blocking the doorway. He puffed out his chest, wearing a sickeningly smug expression that made my blood run absolutely cold. He loudly declared that the guest house was being repurposed as a private yoga studio for Monique starting today. He ordered Tariq to get his worthless trash off the property immediately, or he would call the police to report a trespasser. Tariq walked out carrying 2 heavy canvas duffel bags. He looked completely exhausted and deeply defeated. He dropped the heavy bags onto the gravel driveway and turned to face his sister. He asked Monique how she could possibly do this to her own flesh and blood. Monique finally looked at him, her eyes completely devoid of any familial warmth or compassion. She coldly stated that this was strictly a business decision and that he had severely overstayed his welcome. She told him that their mother owned the entire estate now, and their mother wanted him gone before noon. I stepped directly between my son and his abusers. Bradley immediately tensed up, balling his hands into tight fists, clearly hoping I would lose my temper and take a swing at him. He wanted me to strike him so he could play the victim, call the local authorities, and press felony assault charges against an old man. I flatly refused to give him that pathetic satisfaction. I did not raise my voice a single decibel. I did not hurl any bitter insults. I simply turned my back to him, looked directly at Tariq and told him to load his bags into the back of my rusty 1998 Ford pickup truck. It was the exact same battered truck I used when I first started my logistics company decades ago, a vehicle Valerie had relentlessly begged me to scrap because it embarrassed her in front of her wealthy friends. Tariq hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding silently. We quietly carried his remaining belongings across the wet morning grass, completely ignoring the venomous taunts coming from the porch. Bradley leaned against the newly replaced doorframe, crossing his arms in a disgusting display of false dominance. As I tossed the last heavy duffel bag into the rusted truck bed, Bradley shouted across the open yard. He told us to enjoy the homeless shelter. He called me a washed-up old man and laughed loudly, a grating sound that echoed across the massive stone estate I had paid for with my own blood and sweat. I closed the heavy steel tailgate with a loud metallic slam, looked at Bradley one last piercing time, and got into the driver's seat without uttering a single syllable in response. The heater in the old Ford roared to life as we pulled out of the grand iron gates of the estate for the last time. Tariq stared blankly out the passenger window, watching the massive mansion slowly disappear in the rearview mirror. He turned to me, his voice cracking slightly, and apologized profusely. He said he felt like a massive burden and that he was the sole reason I lost everything in the brutal divorce. I kept my eyes firmly fixed on the road ahead and gripped the worn leather steering wheel. I told my son to never apologize for who he is or the noble work he does. I explained that the millions of dollars sitting in those offshore corporate accounts never truly mattered to my soul. I grew up with absolutely nothing, wearing hand-me-down clothes, and I knew exactly how to survive on nothing. My entire goal in building that massive logistics empire was to create a lasting legacy of helping our community. I wanted to build modern schools, fund youth community centers, and lift our people out of generational poverty. Valerie took that righteous dream and twisted it into a nightmare of endless consumption and hollow high society gala events. She completely destroyed the soul of our family just to acquire more useless luxury objects to fill her massive empty rooms. I looked over at Tariq and assured him that losing the stone mansion was not a defeat at all. It was simply a highly necessary sacrifice to fully expose the deep rot that had infected our family tree. The heavy silence between us was comforting, a stark contrast to the shouting and cruelty we had just escaped. I knew that Tariq was the only real wealth I had left, and protecting his future was my ultimate priority. Once we reached the main interstate highway, I pulled the heavy truck over onto the gravel shoulder. I reached deep into my heavy coat pocket and pulled out my secure cell phone. I dialed a private unlisted number that I had memorized years ago. The encrypted line rang exactly twice before my attorney Jonathan answered. Jonathan was not just a standard family divorce lawyer. He was a ruthless corporate strategist who had helped me navigate the treacherous waters of international business for over 20 years. He was the only person on earth who knew the absolute terrifying truth about my complex corporate finances. I stared at the morning commuter traffic rushing past our parked truck. I spoke clearly and firmly into the receiver. I told Jonathan that the bait was officially taken. I confirmed that Valerie had taken full physical possession of the estate and that Monique and Bradley were aggressively moving their belongings into the main house as we spoke. I told him they had forcibly evicted Tariq this morning, exactly as we had predicted they would during our strategy meetings. They were acting entirely on their own blind greed, rushing to claim their stolen prizes without conducting a single shred of financial due diligence. They were so incredibly desperate to sit on the fake throne that they never bothered to check if the majestic castle was built on a foundation of quicksand. Jonathan let out a low, deeply satisfied chuckle on the other end of